Hello, and welcome to this panel presentation at the United Nations Human Rights Council 48th session in Geneva, Switzerland. This event is titled Self-Determination for Alaska and Hawaii, Re-examining UNGA Resolution 1469. It is under the auspices of Incomendios, an NGO in consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. In 1959, the UN General Assembly adopted Resolution 1469 under the mistaken belief that the people of Alaska and Hawaii had exercised their right to self-determination and consented to be integrated into the United States of America as the 49th and 50th states, respectively. The error aided and abetted the United States in its subjugation and pillaging of the people and lands of Alaska and Hawaii, causing serious injury and trauma to 3 generations of people, depriving them of the right to self-governance and the right to determine access to and use of their lands and resources. This panel asserts it is time for the UN to meet its obligation to correct its error and ensure just remedy for the 60 years of abuses of the human, civil, political, and developmental rights of the people of Alaska and Hawaii. The object of this side event is to prompt the Human Rights Council to call on the UN General Assembly to conduct a review of the adoption of Resolution 1469. We expect that the review will inevitably reveal 1469 was adopted in error, thus requiring the UN General Assembly to rescind Resolution 1469. When that happens, the Hawaiian Kingdom reemerges as an independent state in continuity, and Alaska is restored to the list of non-self-governing territories for decolonization. My name is Robert Kajiwara, president of the Peace for Okinawa Coalition, a nonprofit organization headquartered in Okinawa City with an extension office in Honolulu, Hawaii, and I will be moderating this panel discussion. First, we turn to representatives of the Native peoples of Alaska. Our first speaker is Ambassador Ronald Barnes. He was first appointed as the Director of Foreign Relations by the Tununak Elder Council, Chair of Indigenous Peoples and Nations Coalition for Alaska. The entity is designated as the free political institution and is now supported by the vast majority of tribal governments in Alaska. Ambassador Barnes resides in Geneva and is head of the mission for the Alaska decolonization movement. He has worked tirelessly for nearly 30 years in advocacy for the rights of the indigenous peoples of Alaska. Ambassador Barnes, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Robert, for your wonderful introduction. I also thank Incomendios for sponsoring this, and also Foreign Minister Laulani Siu for working to make this available to us, and also to you, Robert, for your coordination of this project. First, I'd like to state that Alaska is fully recognized international state of peoples under international law, and we're subjects of international law. I was appointed as ambassador in 1994 by the Elders Council of Tununak, and when the United Nations experts discovered this, they asserted to me that you must always assert and demand dignity and respect, as well as the peoples of Hawaii, for your representation and your appointment for your posts to pursue your international legal and political status. Of course, we're talking about invalidating or annulling General Assembly Resolution 1469, which was adopted by the General Assembly on the 12th of December 1959, without the knowledge, the participation, or the consent of the indigenous peoples of Alaska. And when we did find out, it was because of the 1982 Alaska Statehood Commission report that was convened by the state of Alaska and ended in 1982, where the state of Alaska revealed that we were subjects of international law. In this report, they also said we still have the right of independence. So we continue to pursue this status. Since then, we have done several nonviolent protests against the state of Alaska and the United States. In 1992, we did a fish-in with the United States, against the United States of America, asserting our right to self-determination. And in response to this, the President George Bush, he ordered the state of Alaska and its authorities not to arrest us. And the reason being was we notified the media, the internet, and the press, and we also notified Pope John Paul II, Prime Minister John Majors, Her Royal Highness the Queen of England, Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom, and we also notified Boris Yeltsin and President George Bush and Boutros Ghali, and the United States government did not want this to go international, even in a press meeting or through the international press. So, of course, Assembly Resolution 1469 states in operative paragraph 2 that the people of Alaska and Hawaii have effectively exercised their right to self-determination and have freely chosen their present status. This is not accurate reporting. It is fake because it is, in fact, based on the Teton v. United States case of 1955, 348 U.S. 272, that determined the land in Alaska was for the settlement of the white race. And settlement of the white race is actually in the footnote 18 of the decision. And it's also based on the 1823 Johnson v. McIntosh case, which said we had to adhere to the superior genius or to the ascendancy of the European civilization. They invoked doctrines of superiority and asserted that they were also superior to us. And in doing this, they violated General Assembly Resolution 644 and General Assembly Resolution 1328, which stated that the administering powers had to abolish all discriminatory law and policy in the administration of a non-self-governing territory. That is only one of the many violations. Of course, as free political institutions in Alaska, it would be our traditional indigenous governments. And the highest of our traditional governments in our Yup'ik culture is our elders' councils. And of course, when you go to the southeast, it's the Kwans. And each respective peoples from Alaska had their own governing authority and hierarchy of authority that the United States failed to follow. And the United States of America, in its effort to gain approval from the United Nations to cede reporting on Alaska and Hawaii under Article 73 of the Charter, one must review the legal character of puppet governments determined in Judgment Number 107 of the Greek Criminal Court of Heraklion in Crete of 1945.
Thank you, Ambassador Barnes. We now turn to Madam Patty Heyano to share more about the impact that U.S. occupation has had on the people of Alaska. Madam Heyano is from Bristol Bay, Dillingham, and Aleknagik, Alaska. She participated in the 1992 fish-in when President George H.W. Bush ordered the state of Alaska not to arrest the Native Alaskan nonviolent demonstrators against the illegal state of Alaska and the United States of America. She is currently the Secretary for the Elders Council in Southwest Alaska, supporting efforts to gain recognition for Alaska's international legal and political status. Madam Heyano, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
My name is Patty Heyano, and I'm speaking to you from Aleknagik, Alaska. I am a Yupik real person on the land. I am the daughter of Mary Backford and George Berg. My parents were severely punished in school for speaking their language and chose not to teach my sister and I how to speak, which means it is more difficult to connect with and learn from our elders. I am not a member of any federally recognized tribe, which are designed to control and limit tribe sovereignty. I traveled to Hawaii in late 1992 with a group of Alaskans and attended the 1993 centennial of the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. We met many indigenous Hawaiians and discussed sovereignty and free association issues. Alaska and Hawaii have long supported each other on the indigenous human right of self-determination. When the Russians came to Alaska to trade with the indigenous peoples, the Russian Ukazis decreed that the Russians were to get permission to build trading forts and not create the mere thought or suspicion that they were attempting to deprive us of our independence. The Ukazis respected our self-governing status, and they learned our language and even translated the Bible into Yupik. When the United States bought us, things were different. They used many tactics to separate the indigenous peoples from their land and resources. The people were treated as subhuman. To illustrate this, consider the fact that the indigenous people on the Pribilof Islands were actual slaves of the U.S. government to kill and process seals until they were freed in 1974. Before the vote of Alaska statehood in 1958, the U.S. government encouraged non-native colonization that brought in farmers who settled in the Matsu Valley and to this day proudly call themselves pioneers. That was based on the New Deal legislation of President Franklin Roosevelt called the Matanuska Colonization Project. The U.S. government also set up military bases and increased the non-native vote through military personnel who were paid $5 per vote. The U.S. government, during the 104 years between the Treaty of Cession and to the Statehood Act, did not explicitly address Aboriginal land claims. In 1971, the U.S. Congress passed the Alaska Native Settlement Act, aka UNGA, to address Native claims. They brought delegates from each village to vote, signing away Aboriginal title. Delegates were taken out, wined and dined, and missed important discussions before votes were taken. As stated in the Shadow Report for the Universal Periodic Review of the United States of America Human Rights Record, the Land Rights Report itself revealed that the indigenous people of Alaska did not agree to the UNGA legislation. In reality, our peoples were never informed of our international status, so it cannot be viewed as legitimate, but a unilateral act of the United States Congress. Special Rapporteur Erica Irene Days confirms that the Alaska Indigenous people did not agree to UNGA. In 1991, 20 years after UNGA, I attended the Bristol Bay Native Association's Tribal Government Conference. I listened to a panel on UNGA, and one of the speakers was an elder who participated and was a signatory to UNGA. This elder was from a different region. He apologized for his role in passing UNGA. One of the local corporate leaders jumped up and belittled this man and said that we do not listen to people from other regions. We make our own decisions. The tirade was so bad that this elder cried. There is a lot of support for the UN revisiting Resolution 1469, but the voices were squelched by local leaders who are corporately affiliated and want to see continuation of the status quo. I will give a couple of examples that illustrate the difference between the indigenous people's will and the will of the local leaders or corporate elite. About 20 years ago, a tribal community center was being planned. At one of the meetings, a local leader was successful at getting his father's name for the center. No one confronted him, but to this day, we still do not have a community center. No one wants to work on a community center named after a local leader that was highly successful at eroding our human and indigenous rights. Another example, in 2012, UN Special Rapporteur James Anya came to Dillingham, Alaska and held a hearing. There were indigenous people testifying on their difficulties living during post-statehood. Then once again, a local leader testified and the other voices became quiet. I do not understand how this happens, perhaps the years that they have spent suppressing our voices. I participated in the 1992 setting of the net, where a group of indigenous people backed by the elders set a subsistence salmon net in defiance of state law off the shore of Dillingham, Alaska. A group included elders that have passed on. But they felt that it was time to stand up for our rights. The women were especially resolute, which is significant in a matrilineal society. Subsistence to us means our way of life. It encompasses all of our culture and traditions, including how we hunt, fish, gather, how we process food, and how our food is distributed among elders, family, and within the community. To us, the word subsistence has no connection to the dictionary definition. In the early 1990s, we had two powerful men standing up for our indigenous human rights. Pat and Steve fought against the state's oppression and in several subsistence court cases. Steve was held in the Dillingham jail for 40 days without a hearing. And in another case, the judge threw out all of their evidence, so they had no defense. In closing, as we stated to the state of Alaska and the United States of America during the 1992 fish-in, you violated your suzerain's trust responsibility to govern on behalf of the tribal governments of Alaska. We are asserting our international right of self-determination under Article 73 of the Charter of the United Nations. We urge you to revisit Resolution 1469.
Thank you, Madam Heyano and Ambassador Barnes, for sharing about the harmful impact UNGA Resolution 1469 has had on the people of Alaska. We now shift our focus across the Pacific to the Hawaiian Islands. For this, we turn to H.E. Leong Kaulahao Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Minister Siu is a prominent strategist, advocate, and spokesperson for Hawaii's independence. He's a familiar participant in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and is working to restore or develop new relations between the Hawaiian Kingdom and other states. He is the chair of the Decolonization Alliance based in New York City, a co-author of the book Modus Vivendi, Situation of West Papua, and was nominated for the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Minister Siu, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Mahalo nui loa. Mahalo for inviting me to be on this auspicious panel with such wonderful people like Ambassador Barnes and Dr. Alfred de Zayas and Patty Heyano, as well as our friend Laulani Teale. We're here to speak toward this issue of the Resolution 1469, which was adopted, as you heard from Ronald Barnes. It was adopted by the United Nations in 1959 on the occasion of removing Hawaii and Alaska from the list of non-self-governing territories, with the assumption that there had been exercises of self-determination, both in Alaska and Hawaii, and the United Nations then accepted this United States report of the referenda that were held, and that proceeded to acknowledge that now Hawaii and Alaska were part of the United States. And this is where our point of contention lies most recently. But, Hawaii and Alaska have been treated as occupied territories up until that time. And then suddenly in 1946, when the United Nations formed or created the list of non-self-governing territories, Alaska and Hawaii were put onto this list. Now, we have been laboring under a bunch of misconceptions over the years. First of all, that placing us on the list of non-self-governing territories, we were in Hawaii not even aware of what was happening at that point. And secondly, it being put on the list actually ignored the fact that Hawaii was still a sovereign nation. In other words, the United Nations and the world had actually swallowed the lie that Hawaii had become annexed to the United States back in 1898. And by using that lie, and then of course using Hawaii as a prominent military base, the biggest military fortress in the Pacific is located here in Hawaii. And because of these reasons, the United States, really was eager to acquire or to integrate Hawaii into the United States. So when we were put on the list of non-self-governing territories, the United States immediately started to try to shift that identification of Hawaii, or that status of Hawaii, into one of United States permanent domination. So that was what the Resolution 1469 was about. The United States had put in a report, A/4226, that reported that Hawaii and Alaska had both conducted referenda, and both places had overwhelmingly approved for statehood. And again, as has been mentioned in the past by others, the referenda were completely illegal, if not, basically they were, they did not prove anything. There was no real referenda because of two factors, well, a number of factors, but two of the most prominent being the fact that the Hawaiian Islands, the people who voted in the referenda were not Hawaiian nationals or indigenous Hawaiians or the people of the land, the people who live there. Most of the voters were all U.S. citizens because that was the criteria by which voting took place. You had to be declared to be a U.S. citizen first, and then you could vote. As a result, 94% of the U.S. citizens that voted in that election approved for statehood. Of course, it was illegitimate because you can't have foreigners, people declaring their allegiance to a foreign country, to determine to self-determine that is not a determination of the self, it's a determination by others and not the self. So that's one point. The other point was that the deck was highly stacked in that there was no educational effort made prior to the 1959 vote. And that was a deliberate omission by the United States to keep Hawaiians in the dark as to the true status of their nationhood. And so the people voted not knowing that there was a possibility, or actually that there should have been a requirement, that a full vote be taking place or full choices be offered. And the choices being independence, or free association, or integration, statehood in this area. None of neither of the two, independence or free association, were ever brought up in the discussion leading up to statehood. And so therefore, there was only one consideration on the ballot, and that was to become a state of the United States or to remain a territory of the United States. So for those two reasons, the United States violated the United Nations intent and its rules on decolonization and on self-determination. So we're saying today that the acceptance of the United States report to the United Nations in 1959 And the United Nations action taken according to that report are what is the word? Should be
Null and void.
The null and void. Yes, exactly. Yes, they are null and void because there's no basis of legal procedures in that. And on top of that, since 1993, well, actually prior to that, but especially since 1993, when the United States apologized for the taking of Hawaii and and mentioned the fact that neither the people granted or gave away our independence, or let's say our sovereignty, or our lands. Now that shows the United States acknowledges that they actually have no basis in law to being in the Hawaiian Islands, and yet they continue to be here. And that is primarily because of the military importance of the Hawaiian Islands, which, by the way, places us, for those of you in human rights listening, places the Hawaiian Islands and all the people of Hawaii and every living thing in Hawaii under jeopardy, under incredible risk of being annihilated by a single nuclear attack to take out the military bases of the United States would annihilate the entire island, well, the entire island of Oahu, and of course, eventually, through the fallout and things like that, eventually kill everything in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific. And so this is our great concern right now, that 1469 binds us. The United Nations mistakenly created a situation in which we're bound to the United States. And the United Nations really needs to reverse its position or to rescind Resolution 1469, because this is causing us has caused us not only 60, close to 70 decades of harm and injury, but places us in mortal danger of annihilation. And so the Human Rights Council needs to act immediately to push for the General Assembly of the United Nations to rescind Resolution 1469. So we are actually calling for a review, and we're asking for member states to sign on or to actually help us introduce a resolution to the General Assembly of the United Nations to review Resolution 1469. And the reason we're asking for a review and not a repeal at this point is that the United Nations needs to find out for itself what happened. So conducting a review would actually show not just inappropriateness, but the illegality of the claim of Hawaii being part of the United States. And so this is what we're embarked upon. And Laulani is going to speak more about the impact of what 1469 had in the Hawaiian Islands. Mahalo nui, aloha.
Thank you, Minister Siu. We now turn to Madam Laulani Teale, a peace builder, activist, and musician from Windward, Oahu, one of the Hawaiian Islands. She is the coordinator for Ho'opaepono Peace Project, an affiliate of Seventh Generation Fund for Indigenous Peoples. She is trained in La'al, traditional herbal medicine, Ho'oponopono, traditional peace process, and midwifery. She is also an artist, mother, and community health worker. She holds a master's degree in public health, specializing in community health development and addressing health issues related to colonization and activism. Madam Teale, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Aloha. I would just like to continue where Minister Siu left off in terms of the forward feedback loop that has really been caused by the human rights violations involved in Resolution 1469. I think what it's very important to understand is that the passage of that resolution was essentially based upon human rights violations in the first place. And the reason that I say that is because when the United States held a plebiscite that, as Minister Siu said, did not meet international criteria for a referendum to measure self-determination, because the only options on that plebiscite ballot were integration or integration. And when that happened, the reason that there wasn't visible resistance was because there had been over 5 decades, about 5 decades of very, very serious genocidal level suppression of people's expression, democracy, and basically pretty much straight up persecution of anyone who resisted United States occupation and colonization of Hawaii in any way. And I think that it's very, very important to remember that from 1893 to 1959 basically is an extreme genocidal story of persecution of any kind of resistance, killing of people who were loyal kingdom subjects, jailing of many others, cultural persecution, persecution of anyone who was a medical practitioner or a cultural practitioner in any way other than within the growing tourist industry. And, of course, World War II peaked in the Hawaiian Islands in the 1940s, and we were under martial law. And everyone during that time who lived during that time remembers the guns, the barbed wire everywhere, the patrols, the curfews. This is not a free society that has the ability to make its own expression of self-determination. Hawaii was just coming out of that into another form of U.S. colonialism during the 1950s, at the time that there was, that this was happening. And during that time, there was no ability to speak out. It was a very hostile environment. And there was no way for the people to be able to articulate the need for self-determination, because that had been already persecuted to such a large and brutal degree within their generation and the generation before them. So I think it's very important to remember that those human rights violations actually are the background story to UN Resolution 1469 in the first place. And then following that, what we have really seen has been a picture of incremental and largely invisible genocide. I need to emphasize very strongly that genocide is genocide, whether it happens quickly or whether it happens slowly, whether it's visible and can be seen right there in the streets, or whether it's invisible and is hidden where no one sees it. And what we have in Hawaii are both types of genocide, but in the most visible places, it's very well hidden. And I'd like to describe a little bit of what that looks like. So since 1959, we have been actively displaced from land. And I mean the people of Hawaii. So not only the indigenous Kanaka Maoli, but also all of the long-term residents of Hawaii, people who have lived here for generations and generations, have found it increasingly difficult simply to exist, to the point that there are many who are houseless. You know, we don't use the word homeless because this is our home, and yet there are many who are living outside. They're living on the streets. They're living on the beaches, or they're trying to, because they can no longer do that either. Those who live in the forest and beaches, which is a traditional practice as well, are persecuted. All their belongings are taken, including medications, including medical records, including, in many cases, the only photographs of their loved ones, and those are essentially destroyed. And it is a very serious thing, and people are brutally treated. In many cases, they're physically brutalized in their removal. And you know, you can see more of that if you look up Namaka Oka'aina's videos. They were a documentary company that went around and actually documented many of the evictions of people who were living outside and on their lands, on their ancestral lands. And you can see the degree of human rights violation, with children screaming and people being dragged off of their land. And this happens all the time. And it is very important to understand that this is happening specifically for the active perpetuation of settler colonialism. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the median price of a house here has gone to over $1 million. So in other words, people cannot afford to stay here. There is nowhere to rent. There's nowhere that they can find the kind of employment that will allow them to live in their own land. Even those who have had lands passed on to them ancestrally cannot afford the property taxes because luxury development is going up all around them. They're being displaced, first to the street and the beaches, and then to jails. And they are being they're being forced out. There are more Kanaka Maoli outside of Hawaii now by far than in Hawaii, and that is because of forcible removal. It is very important to understand this. Meanwhile, our lifeways are impossible to live. But I am an herbalist, and I cannot go to many places to gather my medicines. You know, I can't access lands that are supposedly protected by the Constitution of the state of Hawaii, which says that Hawaiian practices will be protected subject to the state of Hawaii's right to regulate those practices. And what that has meant in practice has been brutality against Native practitioners. I work with fishermen who have been literally brutalized by state enforcement, tortured, hunters who terrible things have happened, like, for example, one man that I worked with had his pants confiscated as evidence, and he was forced to walk 2 miles with no pants back to his car, while he was very legally practicing traditional hunting. A fisherman was forced to stare into the sun while he was perfectly legitimately fishing in a sheer act of terroristic harassment. And these things are very, very common. They happen all the time. Those who do not have housing are brutalized, they're ostracized, they are refused medical care. Many of them who need surgeries or other medicine in the hospital are released with deep surgical wounds straight onto the street, which has given rise to very serious pathogens in the environment where there are many houseless people and other very serious impacts like this. And none of this is documented or reported by the United States or the state of Hawaii. I think that it is very important to understand that we have such very serious health problems, and this is one of the most important manifestations of incremental genocide, that we are being killed daily by heart disease, diabetes, cancer, stroke, and alcoholism, abuse, and many other things at rates that are much higher than any other ethnic group or any other people. They're astronomically higher. And the reasons for this are very simple. We do not have access to the basic things that we need to be healthy. And two of those main things are foods, our traditional foods, which we do not have access to because we do not have the land to grow our kalo. We do not have the water to grow our kalo. All of that is taken in exploitive development and tourism and military related projects. We do not have the basic self-determination to be able to do those things that we need to do. We traditionally are a very robust, active people, but we don't go to gyms traditionally. We work the land. We fish the ocean. We have a relationship to our home, and those things are actively denied us at the point of a gun. And I think that it's very important to understand that this is absolutely happening every single day in Hawaii. And these are coming from the same source that allowed the misrepresentation of our situation in the first place to go forward unchecked. When the United States wrote a letter on September 17th, 1959, saying that everything had been resolved and we don't have a problem here. the fact that the United Nations that took the United States word for it, did not even look into the problem, is coming from that same source that this brutality is coming from. So I think that that it is very, very important to look at that. Also, there is a concept called ea in our culture. Ea is self-determination. It is the life breath of sovereignty that exists in every person, in every human being on this earth. And in our traditional view of health, ea is incredibly important for our health and well-being. In fact, it's almost synonymous with health and well-being. And when you do not have true self-determination that comes from inside you and can manifest in the world as we are all meant to do, you become very, very ill, and it will eventually kill you. And that is what is happening to our people. We are dying in huge numbers because our air has been cut off. Our food supplies has been cut off. Our relationship to our land and our water has been cut off. Our sense of well-being has been cut off. And that has resulted in a human rights crisis in our country, Hawaii, which is illegally held by the United States. And I don't want to go, sorry, I think I've probably gone over time, but I do just want to emphasize that these things that are happening in Hawaii are a reflection of a worldwide crisis of exploitation. Without resolving that crisis on a worldwide level, starting with a case that is so simple as Hawaii is, because it's just a matter of undoing a mistake that was done. Without resolving that, there cannot be well-being for anyone on this earth. As Minister Siu said, we are at grave risk of annihilation. The reason that Pearl Harbor was attacked in the 1940s was not because of the oysters. You know, it was because of the United States military's presence and their threat against many countries of the world. Many countries in the world right now are standing up and saying that it is not all right for the United States to perpetuate the myth that it is working for peace when in fact it is oppressing the resistance to its brutality so that nothing is heard. Peace is not that kind of silenced tranquility. That is not peace. Peace is the restoration of the well-being and a voice of all peoples of this earth, and protection from harm. If we are wiped out in nuclear disaster, which could very well happen, as we are a very serious target due to United States aggression all over the world. If that happens to us, it will happen to everyone, because once that nuclear annihilation happens, it cannot stop. It cannot stop, and it will not save. It will not spare anyone. And right now, we are in a point of crisis globally, with climate change, with militarization, and war with the overall exploitation of people, where we no longer have the luxury of time to mince words. We need to speak directly to this problem, and we need to set things right. In our traditional peacemaking process, ho'oponopono, we believe that peace is about simply setting right. And that means looking at that which is wrong and simply correcting it. It's really that simple. And what that means is that the human rights of the people of Hawaii need to be examined, and the human rights of the people of the world need to be examined, and that those rights need to be addressed. And that means setting right that which was done wrong, which is holding our people in this situation of very, very serious brutality and potential threat for all of life on Earth. And so yes, we ask you to please review Resolution 1469, and please undo this wrong and set right not only Hawaii, but this planet that we all share. Mahalo.
Thank you, Madam Teale. We have now heard from representatives of both Alaska and Hawaii regarding the impact that UNGA Resolution 1469 has had on their respective peoples. To close this panel, we now turn to Professor Alfred de Zayas of the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He is a leading expert in the field of human rights and international law, and a high-ranking UN official. He was the original UN independent expert for a democratic and equitable international order. He is also a former senior lawyer with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Secretary of the Human Rights Committee, and the Chief of Petitions. He has authored a number of books in several languages, the latest of which is Building a Just World Order, published by Clarity Press. Professor de Zayas, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Robert, Ronald, Patty, Laulani, Leon. I wholeheartedly endorse what preceding speakers have laid out. And I'm going to ask for your indulgence because there's a lot that I want to say, and I've written it down. And I'm going to make this text available to my successor, Dr. Livingston Sewanyana, who is the current independent expert on international order. And I will make it available to the assistance of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. And I think it's useful for the listeners to have the full text of this presentation, which I timed at 15 minutes. I hope that it will, in fact, be 15 minutes. Excellencies, colleagues, in my 2014 report to the General Assembly, submitted in my capacity as independent expert on international order, I argued that the realization of the right of self-determination of peoples is a crucial factor in conflict prevention. Indeed, it is all too obvious that many wars since 1945 had their origins in the unjust denial of this right because of the prevailing colonialist and imperialist mindset to hold on to occupied territory. I argued that it was the vocation of the United Nations to deploy preventive strategies, including giving timely attention to the justified grievances of peoples still living under foreign occupation or otherwise denied internal and external self-determination. I further elaborated the legal basis of my arguments in chapters 2 and 5 of my new book, Building a Just World Order, in which I also formulate 25 principles of international order, and principle 10 of my principles of international order focus on self-determination and its ramifications. I called for inclusion of self-determination as a permanent item on the agenda of the Human Rights Council, as indeed it had been a permanent item of the Commission on Human Rights. I insisted on the importance of elevating the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to the level of universal hard law by virtue of a treaty, and proposed that the General Assembly obtain a pertinent advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. I further proposed the establishment of the function of a special rapporteur, or rather a special advisor, to the Secretary General on the issue of self-determination. Notwithstanding the fact that the UN Charter in Article 1, common to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, clearly stipulate the right of self-determination as jus cogens, also peremptory international law, and a core human right, geopolitical considerations have made it impossible for many peoples to achieve self-government, among them the peoples of Alaska, Hawaii, Ryukyu, West Papua, Rapa Nui, the Mapuches of Chile, etc. Pursuant to Chapter 11 of the UN Charter, the organization must assist peoples towards self-government and should organize self-determination referenda where appropriate. Furthermore, I have focused on the systemic discrimination of indigenous peoples in many countries, including Australia, Brazil, Colombia, Canada, Chile, and the United States, where indigenous movements have been suppressed and an attempt has been undertaken to render indigenous invisible or to force them to assimilate. There is a consistent pattern of harassment and arrests, not unlike the treatment of Afro-Americans in the United States, giving rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. With even greater justification, I would like to see an Indigenous Lives Matter movement arise, perhaps as a development of the Idle No More movement in Canada. This surely deserves the full support of major non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. However, I harbor certain doubts because major NGOs are dependent on donations precisely by these hegemons. As I elaborated in several of my reports to the General Assembly and Human Rights Council, we are faced with a serious problem of selectivity, double standards, censorship, self-censorship, and silence from the mainstream media. Indeed, there's a kind of blackout when it comes to the reality of apartheid on indigenous populations. I recently reviewed the brilliant dissertation by Tamara Star Blanket, an indigenous from Canada. Here's the book. She draws attention to the continuing cultural genocide of the First Nations of Canada and the scandalous treatment of Canadian Indigenous in the infamous so-called residential schools, something that has now become topical, but it will probably be forgotten very soon unless non-governmental organizations like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch pick it up. Perhaps this scandal will finally put indigenous concerns on the map of the leading mainstream media outlets. On 25 February 2018, when I was still independent expert, I stated in a memorandum to members of the U.S. state of Hawaii judiciary, I quote, "The lawful political status of the Hawaiian Islands is that of a sovereign nation state in continuity, but a nation state that is under a strange form of occupation by the United States, resulting from an illegal military occupation and a fraudulent annexation. As such, International law requires that governance and legal matters within the occupied territory of the Hawaiian Islands must be administered by the application of the laws of the occupied state, in this case the Hawaiian Kingdom, not the laws, the domestic laws of the occupier, the United States. Quote, in a subsequent memorandum dated 30 April 2018, addressed to the Secretary General and members of the UN Decolonization Committee, I denounced the anomalous legal situation in Alaska and referred to my official visit to Alaska in June 2014. To buttress my arguments, I incorporated the rationale set forth in the shadow report submitted by the Indigenous Peoples and Nations Coalition and the expert papers presented by Ambassador Ronald Barnes to the Human Rights Council, its special procedures, and various United Nations treaty bodies. I reaffirmed the continued validity of the first progress report of the Special Rapporteur to the UN Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights, the famous study on treaties, agreements, and other constructive arrangements between states and indigenous populations. This report highlighted the fact that the 1867 treaty between the Russian Empire and the United States of America concerning the transfer of Russian interests in Alaska to the United States did not and could not grant title to the U.S. over Alaska, quite simply because Russia did not have title. Nemo dat quod non habet, a well-established principle of international law. In Professor Miguel Alfonso Martinez's 1999 final report, he correctly stated that the burden of proof lies on states to demonstrate that they have properly acquired the territory of indigenous peoples, which the United States has not done. It is my conviction as professor of law that the indigenous peoples of Alaska do possess international status, which they can assert without threat, duress, and coercion as subjects of international law. The United States of America, its political subdivisions and courts cannot reduce, diminish, or extinguish the international status of indigenous peoples by invoking domestic United States law. Indigenous land rights and the right of self-determination exist because indigenous Alaskans never relinquished their status or ceded their rights to the United States. It is worth recalling that the 2006 conclusions and recommendations of the Human Rights Committee concerning the second and third periodic reports of the United States pursuant to Article 40 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights call upon the U.S. to address the permanent trusteeship of Alaska. I would also like to reiterate the recommendation in paragraph 69, little n, of my report to the General Assembly in 2013. There, I want to involve the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which should henceforth transmit to the Decolonization Committee of the General Assembly all petitions received from indigenous individuals and peoples living under neocolonialism and occupation. I specifically asked that the status of Alaska and Hawaii be revisited and relisted under Chapter 11 of the United Nations Charter. This necessitates, of course, reviewing General Assembly Resolution 1469, which must be modified in order to implement the spirit and letter of Chapter 11 of the Charter and the will of the indigenous peoples of Alaska and Hawaii. In the cases of Alaska and Hawaii, we are faced with an anomalous situation because, unlike the peoples of Asia and Africa who were properly decolonized under the auspices of the United Nations, the illegal occupation of Hawaii, which began with the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893, and the colonization of Alaska by American settlers continues to this day. General Assembly Resolution 1469 only placed a thin veneer of legitimacy over the continued occupation of Alaska and Hawaii, which, far from being decolonized, were actually annexed by the United States, becoming, as we know, the 49th and 50th states of the Union. Fake news, fake history, and fake law have played an important role in this tragedy. Pursuant to General Assembly Resolution 1469, the U.S. was relieved from the obligation to report under Article 73 of the Charter after finding that the people of the territory had exercised, I quote, self-government by choosing to become a state of the United States of America. This determination, however, was fundamentally flawed, since the United Nations had failed to properly monitor the conduct of the so-called referenda, which were completely vitiated by the intimidation against Native voters and the encouragement to all settlers and even military forces stationed in Alaska and Hawaii to vote for union with the United States. Absolutely aberrant situation, absurd situation, since in a self-determination referendum, only the natives have a right to participate and not the settlers, and certainly not the military. In the light of such fundamental flaws in the adoption of Resolution 1469, the General Assembly should order a review of UN compliance with the provisions of Chapter 11 during the relevant years from 1946, the year in which Hawaii and Alaska were inscribed in the list of non-self-government territories, under Resolution 66, until 1959. The General Assembly should initiate a review of the representations made in the U.S. Report A/4226, which was submitted on the 24th of September 1959, ostensibly to be in compliance with Article 73E. And also, the General Assembly must fact-check the consequent discussions and procedures that led to adoption of GA Resolution 1469. A careful review of the case reveals that the General Assembly adopted its resolution under false pretenses, on the basis of false and incomplete information provided by the United States, relying on representations that were tainted by grave material and procedural irregularities surrounding the so-called referenda. The logical consequence of the above is the nullity of Resolution 1469, and in this context, it is important to recall that there exists precedent for overturning GA resolutions, as we know, from the revocation of GA Resolution 3379 of 10 November 1975, the resolution on Zionism as a form of racism, which was overturned by virtue of Resolution 46/86 of 1991. Of course, I do not underestimate practical considerations concerning necessary economic and social adjustments following the revocation of Resolution 1469. We are aware that certain dislocations will be inevitable, but the international community can very well cope with a gradual evolution that will give to the indigenous of the world the rights that hitherto have been denied to them. The bottom line is that the European colonization of the Americas continues. It never ended, as the indigenous continue to live in a form of colonial subjugation. And unlike the peoples of Africa and Asia, the original nations were never restored to independence and prosperity, partly because they were victims of physical genocide, and partly because the European settlers had grown so numerous that the indigenous became minorities in their own lands. Only the names of the rivers, mountains, lakes, cities, and villages remain as testimony of their existence. Martin Luther King drew attention to the tragedy of Native Americans in his 1964 book, Why We Can't Wait. Page 120, by the way, I have a scan of the book if anybody wants to read it, because when you read it, you almost don't believe it. So what did Dr. King write? Our nation, meaning the United States, our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalted. End of quote. These words are, of course, tough, but they are true. That is perhaps why this aspect of Martin Luther King's legacy is systematically ignored by the media, why it is not being taught in high schools and universities. I sincerely hope that one day history will give credit to Dr. King for taking up the cause of indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, 60 years after Dr. King wrote these words, racism against indigenous Americans, Canadians, and other native groups persists. And many do not forget the signs that used to hang in South Dakota stores or near the Navajo Reservation in Arizona and in so many other places in the American West. I quote, "No dogs or Indians allowed," unquote. This kind of humiliation is difficult to forget. Let us hope that politicians listen, recognize the immensity of the crimes committed and still being committed against the indigenous peoples of North and South America, as well as the natives of Hawaii, Ryukyu, West Papua, and of so many other indigenous in the rest of the planet. Let us make an effort to rehabilitate the survivors, giving them, at the very least, the rights enunciated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and through affirmative action, let us ensure the education of indigenous children in their respective indigenous cultures and languages. Let us insist that indigenous cultures, practices, and languages be recognized by UNESCO as intangible world heritage and henceforth protected by national legislation in all countries where indigenous live. Let us urge the 48th session of the Human Rights Council to prompt the General Assembly to conduct the necessary review of General Assembly Resolution 1469, and in the meantime, grant observer status to the Alaskan and Hawaiian peoples so that they can fully participate in the activities of the Human Rights Council and of the General Assembly. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor de Zayas. As all of our speakers today have indicated, UNGA Resolution 1469 has had an undeniably harmful impact on the people of both Alaska and Hawaii. We strongly urge the UN General Assembly to review and revoke UNGA Resolution 1469. This concludes today's panel discussion. Thank you so much to all of our speakers today for sharing your knowledge and expertise. Thank you to the UN Human Rights Council for allowing us to speak today. Thank you to Encomendios for accrediting this event. Here is a list of our email contacts for our speakers. Please do not hesitate to reach out to us if you would like more information or if you would like to get in touch with any of our esteemed guests. Thank you again for watching, and we will see you next time.